the escalation in the Middle East, it seems that the war is somehow coming, and the United States and Iran would confront after all these negotiations, the second round of negotiations. And we had the Iranian foreign minister talking about that the American part, Steve Witkoff, together with Kushner, didn't ask even for, you know, zero enrichment in the second round of negotiation, which was totally the opposite way, that the way that they were, it was
Mhm.
announced in the mainstream media in the West. It was totally the opposite way. And here is what Associated Press just moments ago, before coming to this live, reported that Iran has now come to the conclusion that the only way that they can stop this cycle of war is to draw blood and to inflict significant harm on the United States and Israel, even if that comes at every high price for themselves. It will be very hard for the Trump administration to do a one and done kind of attack in Iran this time around, because Iranian would respond in a way that would make all out conflict inevitable. What is, Ambassador, on the current situation between Iran and the United States?
Well, I take the statement that Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner have not asked for zero enrichment to mean that they are just stringing Iran along in the negotiations. They have no intention of reaching an agreement. And I note that the initial arguments between the United States and Iran were over the agenda for negotiations. We actually didn't have a negotiation going on anywhere. So the United States, at the insistence of Israel, declared that there would be no negotiations unless they addressed the whole nuclear program in Iran, Iran's missile forces and self-defense capabilities, and Iran's relationship with resistance movements in the Levant, meaning Hamas, meaning Hezbollah, meaning the Houthis in Yemen. And so the public portrayal of these talks is that they're all about the nuclear program. It's pretty clear that the nuclear program isn't really the focus. And it is not the focus of either Israeli or US policy under Donald Trump. What is the focus is the incapacitation of Iran. It's the elimination of its self-defense capability, its subordination to Israel and the United States. I think there's a difference. The United States would probably be satisfied under Donald Trump reducing Iran to the status of Venezuela, but Israel would prefer to reduce it to the mess that is now Syria. So people are asking, well, what are the odds of war? Who knows what the odds of war are, because it all depends on the decision of Donald Trump. And he is as predictable as the score on a pinball machine. You cannot tell what result will happen when you fire the ball, the little steel ball, into the maze in the pinball machine. So I think people who pull out numbers, many of them reflecting a hope that there will be no war, that somehow Donald Trump can find a way to get out of the corner he has painted himself into. I don't believe that. I think, I won't say war is a certainty, but it's very close to one. And if it happens, I think the AP article you just quoted correctly describes Iranian thinking as I understand it. Namely, the West, the United States, Britain, Israel pose an existential threat to the Islamic Republic. And an existential threat to the Islamic Republic will be met by it with an existential threat to Israel and serious damage to the United States, because Iran up to now has essentially been prepared to accept provocations and attacks and respond only in limited ways. So we have, for example, the June War, where basically, as I understand it, there was signaling going on between the United States and Iran, and the United States persuaded Iran that it was only going to carry out a very modest level of symbolic attack against nuclear facilities. That is, of course, not what happened. But I think it accounts for the fact that the Iranians did not try to shoot down the aircraft that were conducting that attack. And they stayed true to that vision of a limited engagement when they carried out what was basically a symbolic attack on a radar at Al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar. So I think this is over. If you pose an existential threat, if you declare that your objective is regime change, if you demonstrate in Venezuela that you have no respect at all for limits or international law, then you will get a brutal, all-out response against any provocation or attack. So I know that the New York Times the other day quoted the Wall Street Journal had a story saying that the Trump administration hoped for a limited one in, one out kind of attack on Iran, but was prepared if that didn't work to go to a war of attrition. I think there are two problems with that. One is, I don't think Iran is prepared for a limited response to a limited attack anymore. I think it will respond with an all-out assault on Israel and on American facilities in the region, including the ships that are part of the two aircraft carriers that are assembling to attack Iran. One of them is apparently not there yet. That is the Gerald R. Ford, is still en route to the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Abraham Lincoln is standing offshore in the Arabian Sea. Anyway, so that's the first problem with that thesis. The second is, really, the United States does not have the ability to carry out an effective war of attrition. And if we get into such a war, as we have done in Ukraine, we will find that our ability to conduct military operations elsewhere, for example, the defense of Taiwan against China, will be depleted to a point where we can't accomplish it. And I would like to point out that we have 11 aircraft carriers. 3 of them are at sea. 8 of them are under repair. If you talk about if there is naval damage, which is entirely possible for 2 reasons that I'll mention, but if there is naval damage, where do you repair those ships? I think you can't get into the Persian Gulf and go to Bahrain, and you have to assume that the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain will be one of the attacks mounted by Iran. Bahrain is a member of the so-called Abraham Accords, and it harbors American forces directed against Iran. So I think it's a logical attack, place to aim at. I don't know how the United States has very limited shipbuilding capabilities these days. It's a long way back to North America. Where in the region do you repair a damaged ship? So I think we're a good deal of what passes for strategic reasoning in the White House these days, and perhaps the Pentagon as well, is wishful thinking based on Israeli propaganda about the outcome of the June 12-day war, so-called, which the Israelis claim, they had the upper hand. In fact, they had to beg for a ceasefire because their defenses had been penetrated very thoroughly. So I think there were about 480 buildings destroyed in Israel by Iranian missiles. This is not a minor thing. And that under circumstances where Iran was very carefully aiming at intelligence and military targets rather than civilian ones, with the exception of a couple of ports. So I think the assumptions that are on the American side going into this war are highly questionable. I think Iran has a very ample ability to retaliate against an attack. It will not hold back, I think. It will not put up with what it put up with before. So the Associated Press article you quoted is, I think, correct.
Do you see Netanyahu not participating in the war in the initial hours of war? Because he tries to say that if the attacks, what he said recently in his last address to, he was talking with the press, and he said that if Iran attacks us, we're going to respond in a way that they have not experienced before. Does it means, what is the implication of that? Is that going to be the United States alone attacking Iran and Israel doing nothing in order to not get hit by Iranian missiles?
No, I think that reflects wishful thinking on the part of Mr. Netanyahu. He would like to have the United States conduct the war and Israel stand by and reap the benefits of it. But that's not possible. Iran will not play that game. So if Iran has been very clear that if it is attacked by either Israel or the United States, it will retaliate full force against Israel. So this is the usual sort of political trickery that Netanyahu is famous for. He's assuring the Israeli public that, Israel is protected by the United States and the Americans will do the heavy lifting and there won't be any problem and so forth and so on. And that's all untrue. And I think smart Israelis know it. And so I just don't give any credibility at all to that. I think Israel will be in this very early on. The real question is, to borrow an analogy from the nuclear warfare scenario, there's something called launch on warning, which means that you don't wait for the missiles or the aircraft that are coming at you to actually bomb you. You fire back immediately once they take to the air. So the question is, will Iran respond to movement in the air or on the sea, missile launches immediately rather than wait? And I think the answer is probably yes. We don't know how many missiles of various sorts Iran has, but Iran does have some weapons. Well, let me make 2 points here. One, clearly Iran has benefited from the arrival of Chinese technology, both new radar systems that can detect stealth aircraft and a very formidable version of the Chinese version of the Russian S-400 air defense, missile defense system. But Iran has its own capabilities. Its own missiles are very accurate. Some of them, I believe, are terminally guided, which means they can strike moving targets like aircraft carriers. Iran has a supercavitating torpedo. I think it's called the Hot in Farsi, meaning whale. It's basically apparently similar to something the Russians have produced called the Shark, and it travels at 300 miles an hour underwater. You can't easily stop it. And one has to imagine that Iran has deployed submarines with this weapon in the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz, and maybe even farther away. So I think this is not as simple as Donald Trump, who is full of himself after the Venezuelan success, may believe. Venezuelan success, I hesitate to call it a success because it was essentially a criminal attack on a sovereign country and an engineered coup d'etat by the vice president against the president who was kidnapped. So is that a success? I'm not sure, but I don't think it's going to be that easy to find and kidnap the leadership in Iran. Israel, in effect, did that in its attack in June. It decapitated much of the Iranian military establishment, but it did it with people who were buried in Iran already. It didn't do it with aircraft or missiles. It did it with spies and agents on the ground. Those spies and agents have been rounded up. I don't think Israel has that capacity anymore. So this is a mess waiting to happen.
Yeah. In your opinion, Donald Trump has some sort of limitation for attacks on Iran, limitation in terms of the time he's gonna, for example, attack Iran in, this weekend or upon because he was giving some sort of deadline to Iranians at 10 days. In 10 days, you're gonna respond. You're gonna. How do you see this? Because how do you see the situation internally, and the translation of that, interpretation of that in and understanding what would be the policy on the part of the Trump administration in terms of the attack on Iran?
I think they'll attack as soon as they're ready. That means when the Gerald R. Ford and company are in place. There's been a huge airlift, well documented in the international media, of ammunition, air defense systems, F-35s, F-20s, all sort of aircraft to the region. And Jordan is full of these aircraft as well as others. There are rumors that they've also been deployed to Azerbaijan or Armenia. Who knows? And presumably Iraq is available, even though the Iraqi government would oppose this. And of course, one of the probable consequences of a war between the United States and Iran is that the Iraqi militias who are aligned with Iran will take action against the American troops who are present. So there'll be a major force protection issue in Iraq. Yeah, I mean, a mess.
Yeah. Do you feel that Netanyahu would be finally satisfied with the Trump administration attacking Iran, or the attack on Iran would be just the starting point for Israel? Because I don't know if you saw Lindsey Graham talking about Saudi Arabia. Here is what Lindsey Graham said.
Is now moving backward. They're attacking the United Arab Emirates pretty viciously for being in the Abraham Accords.
Well, they say it's because of Sudan and Yemen.
There is no good reason for this. You can have disputes about Sudan and Yemen, but they're basically declaring war.
I think that's typical nonsense from Senator Graham. He poses as a foreign policy expert. He's actually a propagandist in the service of Israel and apparently also the UAE. No, there are very good reasons for the quarrels that have broken out between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they do have to do with their being on different sides in a whole series of battlegrounds, beginning with Yemen, but including Somalia and Sudan. I don't think that the personal relationship between Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, is not good at present. It started out promisingly but it turned out that Mohammed bin Zayed was not able to control Mohammed bin Salman, who had his own ideas about where Saudi Arabia's and his own interests lay. So we have a very different approach to regional affairs from these two countries. Saudi Arabia is basically conservative. It likes the status quo. It recognizes the established governments. It supports them. The UAE does not like the status quo. It prefers to support insurgent movements or opposition movements everywhere from Libya to Somalia, and in Sudan, and in Yemen. It is a practitioner, a famous practitioner of realpolitik, but it feels that its security lies in destabilizing rather than stabilizing the countries around it. And of course, in the context of a war with Iran, Iranian relations with UAE are deeply troubled by disputed claims over basically barren islands in the Strait of Hormuz. But one of the things that Iran has done as a signal clearly related to what I think are fake negotiations going on between Iran and the United States is shut down part of the Strait of Hormuz just to show that it can do it. And it can do it. And I think one of the things that you say, well, will Netanyahu be satisfied with this war? Well, it depends on how the war turns out. The war could turn out with Israel devastated and the Iranians taking territory from the UAE that is currently in dispute. In other words, if you break the rules, don't expect Iran to follow them. So I don't know how this war is going to turn out, but my strong suspicion is, as I said at the outset, that nobody is going to like the way it turns out. And Netanyahu is very unlikely to be satisfied with it because it is not going to cause the breakup of Iran, and it is not going to make regime change of any sort that is positive from an Israeli perspective. If there is regime change, it's likely to be more anti-Israeli and anti-American than the Islamic Republic has been. So I think this is a war that is foolish, and the overconfidence of the Trump administration reminds me. I don't know if you know, Nima, that when in 1914, when the German army attacked Belgium, a neutral state, in order to get at France, Kaiser Wilhelm tried to get them to stop, the military to stop. He didn't approve this. It was part of the plan that the German general staff had developed. Once they began to put it in motion, they couldn't stop it. And I think there's a lot of similarity now. You move so many forces against Iran into the region, and something happens and motion starts. I don't think you can stop it. I think it plays out. And if it takes, 10 days, 2 weeks, the United States is going to be out of ammunition. And maybe have some ships it can't repair. Maybe some at the bottom of the sea. Of course, Iran will be badly damaged too. And Israel, I think, will be devastated on a level that it's never experienced. So Israel has had the luxury of having military dominance in the region. It has had the luxury of having enemies who are armed only with light weaponry, don't have air forces, who don't have air defenses. Iran has a very different enemy indeed, as it has shown.